And actually, that's the key to change at vast scale, is to make the offer that we make so good, so compelling, so beguiling, so intriguing that our audience comes and gets it from us. And I think that's been really fundamental to our approach. Our interest is to change society. In order to achieve that, we need to reach millions of people. In order to reach millions of people, we have to get to a place where they voluntarily engage with us. They come and pull the ideas from us, because there's no way that we could ever push the ideas to that many people if they're not packaged in the right way, if they're not plucked from our hands by enthusiastic young people.
Wow. Talk about an ambitious goal, changing society through humans. It's absolutely amazing and inspiring. And I think we'd like to discover for our listeners a little bit more on how you go about it. So, Well Told Story and the Shujaaz brand, I happen to know that you're offering a wide range of services and programs. And this is a podcast that specifically looks at skills development, capacity, learning, and training. So talk to us a little bit about what kind of skills and capability building programs you are using, and especially the new ones that I happen to know you are trying to bring to market right now.
Right. So at the beginning, we used comic books. I mean, at the heart of our business has been comic books, because they're a very reliable way. They have been a very reliable way of capturing the attention of that target audience we have, those young people. A comic book requires very little except distribution. It needs a great story, and it needs to be within reach of our audience. And then we've backed that up with FM radio and with social media and SMS originally. But our use of technology has changed as our audience has changed. So when we first began this work in 2010, then I used to wave comics around and say, these things are ICT. This is communications technology, this comic book. And at the time that was true. I mean, that it was new, it was radical in a way 10 years ago. But, fast forward to the present day, and almost 40% of young people in Kenya tell us they have a smartphone and they're using the internet. Of course they are. And so as soon as they have access to the internet, the way they want to engage with stories, the way they want to engage with content, and their ability to do that changes completely. So we are in the process of changing too, and trying to shift the way we engage people to more flexible, more targeted, more direct digital channels. So we've learned a few things along the way, though. We've learned that young people in Kenya don't want to learn from the professor. They don't want to learn from the expert. Actually, those experienced senior authority figures are very poor teachers to our audience, who are unconvinced that the older generation can provide them with good wisdom and reliable advice. So actually, where we focus is on the use of peer-to-peer stories, peer-to-peer accounts, where we find successful young hustlers these days, where we focus a lot of our time, young hustlers who've done something successfully and are willing to share their wisdom in online video and in online communities. So then our job is to point our audience at these role models, at these communities online, and say, well, maybe there's something you can learn from this person. Maybe your circumstances fit the circumstances of this other young person who's only 1 or 2 years ahead of you, but seems to be doing quite well. Maybe just by listening in on that person tell their story, you might get the boost in confidence, the boost in your understanding of skills, a boost in your feeling of empowerment that you too can kick off your career or polish a project that you're working on.
Yeah. Since we're talking a lot about hustling, I think it would be useful, Rob, if we spend a minute or two to explain a little bit what hustling in Kenya or Tanzania or Sub-Saharan Africa means. I could imagine that a lot of our listeners are in North America and Europe. They might have a little bit of a different understanding of what hustling is. So if you have a career of hustling in Kenya, Tanzania, what does that mean?
There are some brutal truths these days, Lutz, in Africa and probably elsewhere too. There aren't enough jobs. The formal sector is not growing at the speed required to employ and absorb and inspire the numbers of young people who are seeking a livelihood. So in Kenya today, this year, 2019 in Kenya, about 1.3 million young people are going to enter the job market. But according to the annual national survey that we do, and we've done for the last 4 years, only about 5% of that 1.3 million army, only about 5% are actually going to get a formal job. So over 1 million people, considerably over 1 million young people are going to be seeking something to do this year, and they're not going to get a job. They're not going to get formal employment. So for those guys to survive, for those guys to thrive, they're going to have to hustle. And that means finding a way to make some cash. It means being enterprising and entrepreneurial. It means looking for short gig economy opportunities. It means making yourself available. It means switching on your radar and seeing where a buck can be generated. It might mean starting a tiny kiosk business, selling something. It might mean providing services in the farming community where you live. It might mean cutting hair. It might mean second-hand goods. It can mean a million different small businesses where the barriers to entry are extremely low because there's no money, there's no startup capital, and where the returns are small but frequent, and where suddenly people can sustain today and perhaps tomorrow by turning a few deals. That's the reality for hundreds of millions of young people across Africa who aren't going to get the chance to go to an office anytime soon and aren't going to get the opportunity to walk into a factory or a workshop and leave on a Friday with a pay packet. That world is not moving at the speed required to keep up with the huge bubble of youth entering the job market. And it's a scary reality. But I'll tell you this, I'm also aware that this story plays out not just in Africa. So there's an interesting theory that we've been reading about this year called cruel optimism. And this is this idea, I think, that when applied in this context, every time we go out and talk to members of our audience, we're meeting young people with a university degree who've saved and whose families have gone without in order to get their young people to the point of graduation with a degree, and now they're unemployed. And they're looking at debt, and they're looking at a future where none of the promises that they were made is coming true. That society, I think maybe since World War II in the West, has been saying, work hard, do well at school, play according to the rules, and you will find your way through school, through college, through university, into a job that society has generated for you. So there's kind of a compact there that if you do these sensible things, if you follow this path, there's a destination waiting for you, and there's a 9 to 5 and there's a pension. And that's the promise of the 20th century. But the promise is broken, and it's certainly broken in East Africa. And I dare say it's broken in a lot of other places. And I think that if you follow the literature through on this, ultimately there are two outcomes that result from this broken promise. And the first one is young people who live only in the present. They're the kind of reckless youth, perhaps, who don't plan ahead. They don't think about tomorrow. They're not concerned about the future because they don't know what the future is. So that's one of the outcomes. But there's another outcome as well, documented in the literature. And that's when young people try to turn the clock backwards to a time when things worked. And I think all over the world, we're seeing that trend. We're seeing Brexit in Britain, when a lot of British people are saying, you know what? I believe there was a time when people like me got respect. People like me had jobs. People like me could understand the world, when the system worked for me. So let's exit from Europe. Maybe that's going to get us back to that place. But maybe make America great again is part of this. There's a time when it worked. I want to be in that time. Let's find a way. Let's build a wall. Let's turn back the clock, because it worked then, didn't it? It worked for white men like me. But what about Al-Shabaab in Africa or ISIS in the Middle East? Let's find a time in the Middle Ages when the world worked. Let's pretend that we can live according to the caliphate, the rules of the Middle Ages. And that's when things functioned. And I think all of these are rather desperate attempts to recapture some sort of confident, reassuring certainty that has become lost. And I think all over the world, we and people like us and young people leaving school are faced by this same uncertainty. What does the future hold? What am I going to do? What's the promise? What's life about? Am I going to make it? And I think a lot of the world's turbulence at the moment, both political, but also in the extremely fast changes we're seeing in the economies of almost all countries around the world, are manifestations of this fear and this lack of confidence, lack of certainty.
I have to tell you, Rob, this is a really deep insight. And I have to confess, when I was mentally preparing for our discussion today, I didn't quite expect that when we were talking about informal workplace learning and youth talent development in Kenya, that we would touch on Brexit. But you made it easy and build the bridge on why it makes sense. So in a way, in a nutshell, is there are more parallels and similarities than on the surface we might expect. We might call it hustling on one continent, and then the gig economy and micro enterprises, as you pointed out, and on other continents. But some of the challenges may be different dimensions. But some of the challenges, some of the wishes, some of the frustrations are very comparable, and so we can learn from each other and how to deal with it. Wonderful insights. On that note,
I'll tell you what, Lutz, just building on that, because unfortunately then the schools are all broken, right? It turns out that for millions of people, the education that they've had is not preparing them for the life they're going to have. So it runs deep, this.
Yeah, that was actually the question I wanted to go in. Do you feel you are filling gaps of what the education system is supposed to do and not doing? Do you see yourself as a natural augmentation of what they do? What's your take on what you do and you feel you have to do and what you're building, how it relates to the official system that's being put in place in Kenya, Tanzania, as it is in other countries, and where they fail? You started thinking about that.
Yeah, good. So, and I think it's important to say, we work in Kenya and Tanzania, so I don't think I'm very well qualified to speak about the situation anywhere else. I can only speculate. But in Kenya and Tanzania, I think I can say that we are definitely seeing ourselves as a significant player in the educational universe for, well, as it turns out, about 9 million young people across the region are following our media and our stories in one way or the other. And we're able to show, because we have gone to enormous depths and lengths to measure the effects of our work. We're able to show that actually the kind of educational experience, and we don't speak internally about our work as education, but the outcomes for young people who connect with our media are measurable and are significant. So it turns out that young people who are walking alongside our stories, who are participating and engaging with our brands, they make more money than young people who don't. And it's definitely because of our media. And we work with several American universities to do extremely sophisticated measurement to prove that. So it turns out that that yes, now I'm not saying we shouldn't send children to school anymore, but I am saying that there's room for very many different ways of engaging people so that they learn and so that they make progress. And I think that what I can say in East Africa is that the school